Good morning, world. I'm Steve Rao, the host of Pod and Roku TV's World Edition, live from the All-America city of Morrisville in North Carolina, the 8th largest state in the United States. And today, we will talk about a very important figure in the history of the United States and the world, the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, who was assassinated in August 1963. We'll also be talking about global affairs, the pandemic, post-pandemic world, global recession, turbulent politics. But the first 30 minutes will be dedicated to talking about this great figure in the history of our nation. Today, my remarks want to be focused on a number of events that I've attended over the last few days through the Triangle Martin Luther King Jr. Committee here in North Carolina, the Research Triangle. And the common theme that we've heard from a lot of people, a lot of ministers and leaders in the community is where we go from here after remembering Dr. King every year. Where do we go from here? And the reminder to all of us, and this is something I said yesterday at an event, that we often look at Dr. King, at the great quotes, the great speeches. I'm going to end this monologue today with a quote from him that I want to share with you. But we often forget about the way that he lived his life. Oftentimes, we just assume that these great leaders and figures where we see memorials like Washington, the Martin Luther King Memorial, or the Martin Luther King Gardens in Raleigh, and we hear the great I Have a Dream speech, we think that he was a larger-than-life figure at the time of his ideas of equality, where he worked with President Johnson to expand civil rights in America, voting rights in America. But we have to remember that what he did was very uncomfortable at the time. He wasn't popular, just like Gandhi. His ideas were not accepted by the majority of American society. And what he was able to do is get others around him to take a look and say, I want to make change happen. And he was inspired by Mohandas K. Gandhi. And so at the end of the day, that's my message today before I end with this quote as we talk about this legacy. We're hoping to have two guests with us. We don't know if they're going to be joining us. Floyd McKissick, the son of the late Floyd McKissick, who was actually a close friend of Dr. King, spoke at the March on Washington and was very involved in civil rights movements around the country and in North Carolina, and Gerald Givens, the Raleigh head of the NAACP. But what I will tell you is that my message is that we often hear of our phones not having enough storage capacity, our devices not having the right operating system or software to run itself efficiently so we can keep up with all of our meetings, all of our text messages, the connections of social media, and also the software that runs on our devices. It seems like we're constantly trying to keep up, and we often forget that the greatest operating system in the world is the human mind and the human heart and the human body. And perhaps these leaders had great operating systems that mattered: empathy, forgiveness, compassion, love. There's no limit in our heart of how much love we can give or take. There's no limit like an iPhone. And so that's my message is today is a day of service. And so what I would ask you to do if you're living in the United States, go to the AmeriCorps Day of Service page, find a community project that you can go and volunteer on instead of taking a day off. I'm not saying this if you're a Republican or a Democrat, anyone from any walks of life, regardless of what you believe, come together and execute my favorite saying, E pluribus unum, from many come one. Before we begin, I want to end with a quote from Dr. King that I think it was really stood out to me today. This was by Dr. King in December 11, 1960, at a sermon entitled The Three Dimensions of a Complete Life. I am absolutely convinced that God is not interested merely in the freedom of black men and brown men and yellow men, but God is interested in the freedom of the whole human race, the creation of a society where all men will live together as brothers and every man will respect the dignity and worth of all human personality. I gave that quote today because I know with us is our dear friend Shaquille Latimer, who often brings the other perspective. But Shaquille does make a point sometimes to emphasize that we're all in this together. As Dr. King said, we all came from different boats, but we're all in the same boat now. So at the end of the day, I think this is an important message for us to share with our children and grandchildren. Be bold, get uncomfortable, bring change, but be respectful in the way you do it. And hopefully we can build a better country and a better world. Now, let's get started. I'm going to bring in Mark Lee. We're going to shoot a note out to our guests. It's kind of a busy day. Hopefully they'll pop in. We have Shaquille Latimer. We have others joining us. Happy MLK Day. Shaquille, welcome to the show. We have Lee Newton Rhodes. We're going to spend a few minutes today talking about Dr. King, his legacy, what perspectives our panelists have about Dr. King. We'd like to maybe get a perspective of Shaquille from, living in Australia, of what the global perspective is. And then after about 30 minutes, we'll dive into the rumble and tumble of politics. But sometimes it's good to take a break. And then we have Dan Worthington as well. So I'm going to begin with Mark Lee as we're waiting for McKissick to join. Mark, what are your thoughts on this day, Martin Luther King Day, and what we should be thinking about?
Well, one of the things that came to my mind automatically is that when I was a youngster, a teenager in the late 70s, I actually had to write a essay. The essay was actually entitled, "Where Did We Go From?"
Whoops. Well, you'll come back. Okay, we're going to go to Shaquille Latimer first, and then we're going to go down. Wait for Mark Lee to come back.
We do have a new guest as well. So I might just add Floyd McKissick. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Okay, let Mark come back in, and then there he is. Okay. Yeah. Well, we are so honored today. We're going to take a break and start over and bring in a very special guest. We welcome to this global podcast and show on Roku TV, Floyd McKissick. I could be here a very long time. His bio is very long. But for those of you listening, Floyd McKissick, first of all, was a Durham City Council member in the city of Durham. He went on to become a very successful state senator, one of the smartest ones in the Senate, and then left to take a job at the Utilities Commission appointed by our Governor Roy Cooper, the North Carolina Utilities Commission. So you have questions about energy and infrastructure, this might be the good man to ask. But the reason he's here today is just last year when we were taking my son to go look at Emory University, where my wife and I went to college, we went to the Civil Rights Museum in Atlanta. And when my wife and I and family were walking, we saw Floyd's father, Floyd McKissick Sr., in the Oval Office with John F. Kennedy. And during the speeches on the main screen, you would see Floyd McKissick's father speaking. Now, my wife knew it was Floyd McKissick's father because she'd seen some pictures in my office that I took when I was in Floyd's office. And she said, I can't believe that we have a North Carolina family that has such a great, strong connection to King. So I couldn't think of a better person on this MLK Day to bring in our special guest, former Senator Floyd McKissick, and the son of Floyd McKissick Sr., a huge legacy of the civil rights movement. So, Floyd, welcome to this global and national audience today on Roku TV.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's always a privilege and honor to join you on this occasion as well as others, and particularly to honor Dr. King and his contributions to the civil rights movement and all that he represented. Somebody who I greatly respect, and somebody who I admire, and somebody who I through example, and someone who was a personal friend to my father, and someone who I thought was an uncle, and marched with so many occasions. A legacy that is very well earned and very well deserved, and so I think it's more fitting and appropriate that we honor him, but in doing so, think of the aspirations and dreams that he aspired to achieve, and think of what we can do today to even come closer to accomplishing those goals and objectives, particularly in a day and time where things are somewhat more divisive in politics, a day and time where we see the Supreme Court making decisions that reverse affirmative action and take other positions that are problematic for the next generation, a time where we need to not only rededicate ourselves to public service, but dedicate ourselves to civic participation in terms of voting to do what needs to be done to make certain we have good people elected to public office that are going to help carry out that dream and do things like reauthorize the Voting Rights Act to give it teeth again. And that the Supreme Court has removed so much of the enforcement mechanisms that it once had.
Now, Floyd, tell us a little bit about the story of your father. I mean, how did he, I mean, you grew up seeing Dr. King, you marched with Dr. King and your father. Could you tell us a little bit before we open it up to questions about just how that impacted you as a young man, what you observed during that time, and the story of your father, which I'd like our audience to hear?
Well, my father was very much involved in the civil rights movement beginning at a time where he was a student. He was applied for admission to the law school at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. We're talking about the late 40s at that point in time. He sued for admission. The case was known as McKissick versus Carmichael. Thurgood Marshall, who became the first African-American justice in the United States Supreme Court, was in fact his attorney. They won that case at the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in federal court. And my father was in fact admitted to UNC's law school, as well as a few other students at that day, time, and era. Upon graduation, he actually instituted a case himself, where he was the lead counsel that integrated the undergraduate school at UNC. This was at a day and point in time before Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, where the U.S. Supreme Court desegregated public schools in our country and said it needed to be done so with all deliberate speed. My father met King in that time frame and in that era. They both, Dr. King was an alumnus of Morehouse College. My father had also attended Morehouse College. My father was involved very much here in North Carolina. And when I say in civil rights activities, it covered a broad range of things from economic boycotts to voter registration drives to doing whatever was necessary to bring about political and social change in that time frame. My father went on to become national chairman of the Congress of Racial Equality and later national director of the Congress of Racial Equality. That organization, Congress of Racial Equality, at that time was known as CORE. At that time, it was the second largest civil rights organization in America. The largest was always the NAACP by several folds. My dad got involved with CORE because they were more proactive and more engaged in things like the sit-ins. They had pioneered in the sit-ins going back to the late 1940s and in the state of Illinois. They were involved in the Freedom Ride, where they put people on buses to go into the Deep South, you know, blacks and whites together, to go into, say, things like bus stations, where when they got ready to get off those buses, they were frequently beaten by police officers and by gangs that were there to attack them. The three civil rights workers that were murdered down in Mississippi, Goodman, Swarner, and Cheney were all people involved in CORE, but so many, 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 many others. King was involved very much in the Deep South, as I refer to it, and he led the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was involved in Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. While CORE was involved in those areas, I would say that SCLC was very much more involved in those particular states. CORE had about 240 odd chapters in 42 different states at that time frame. So they were more of a national organization, whereas SCLC tended to be more regional in its focus. I can remember particularly marching with King during the Meredith March for Freedom. Meredith was the first African American that graduated at the University of Mississippi, integrated that institution, similar to my dad when he integrated UNC's law school. And first day into that march, this was back in 1966, a sniper came along to shoot Meredith. He didn't die, but my dad, Dr. King, and Stokely Carmichael was the leader of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He succeeded John Lewis, the late Congressman John Lewis, in adding that organization. They came together in Memphis, Tennessee, announced they would continue that march. I went down for that march at that point in time and participated with Dr. King, Stokely, and my dad. And in fact, we stayed at that Lorraine Motel. That was the famous motel where ultimately less than a year and a half later, Dr. King was shot on the very balcony. But it was a very significant march and a transitional point in the civil rights movement where the term Black Power began to be used and recognized the first time when it was chanted at a church in Greenwood, Mississippi by Stokely Carmichael in that time frame. The civil rights organizations worked together collaboratively. Each had a goal, each had its purpose, but they were all friends. And that picture you saw that was taken with late President Kennedy was on August 28th, 1963, at the March on Washington, where there were 10 civil rights leaders that spoke that day. My dad was among those 10. And that was the very occasion where Dr. King gave that famous speech, which has now been memorialized in our national history, where he talked about having a dream where people will be considered by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, a dream that basically set a tone and a message for the civil rights movement in so many regards and in so many respects. So on this particular day, to honor Dr. King is fitting, it's appropriate, it's significant. But the thing that I want us to always remember is that there were also so many others who gave their lives, so many others that contributed, so many others who broke headway here in our state in North Carolina that I can think of as leaders that we should also remember, at least locally and regionally, for their contributions to the civil rights movement as well.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to open it up to questions now. It's more of an informal fireside chat. So, Floyd, thank you for being with us. We have 10 minutes left for you. Mark, go ahead.
No, I appreciate it. Floyd, one of the things I was curious about is one of the books, and what I was getting ready to say before you came on, and all in that space that I was really admiring about Dr. King was a book called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. And it was definitely a book that inspired me. I know that when I went to a journalism camp in the late 70s, we had to write an essay about what that message was and how that message would resonate at that particular time. That was the time that I was in high school. And one of the scary things is that the book was written in 1967. I was writing that in 1979. And a lot of the issues that were featured in that book are still issues to this day. The need for better jobs, higher wages, decent housing, and quality education. Those are some of the things that Dr. King talked about in that particular book. And I was just wondering your thoughts around that particular part of his legacy and what you think Dr. King might think about the current state of the world now compared to what he was fighting for during those times.
Well, I think Dr. King would feel proud of the progress that has been made. He feels proud of the fact that we had a first African-American president elected in 2008 and that he got reelected. I think he'd be very disappointed by the divisiveness that followed because of the fact that this African-American had become the leader of our country and how many people felt they were becoming marginalized or losing things because of that. I think that Dr. King would be very saddened by the current generation that is not as politically as engaged as they need to be, that are complacent, that are not actively engaged in social change, that are not actively engaged in fighting for candidates for election, that are not actively engaged in voting at the level that they should. I think so many of the young people today take for granted things that are part of their lives because of the accomplishments of the civil rights movement. And I think that he would sit back and say, hey, you're going to lose a lot of that if you don't fight. We got to take this to the next level. We got to take it to the next chapter. We got to make sure that we do become that all-inclusive society where we embrace everybody based upon, not regardless of their race, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity, and understand that politics is so very, very, very important. And there's not 1 year that passes that we shouldn't be out there getting good people elected to vote. I think he'd be very disappointed as somebody who really fought for the Voting Rights Act, along with the other civil rights leaders, to see that the U.S. Supreme Court has now taken it, and it hasn't been shredded, but there's not a whole lot left of it, and that the Congress of the United States is refusing to come together to reinstate the pre-clearance provisions as well as other provisions that, allowed people to vote. I mean, back in 65, there were ostensible barriers such as poll taxes, such as literacy tests. There were challenges to people to vote and to get registered to vote. You had to go there to a precinct in North Carolina between 9 a.m. and 1 o'clock in the afternoon and appear before a registrar to get registered. Now you can register at a public library. Now you can register when you get your car title. You can go out there and get somebody knocking on your door who's not a registered to get you registered to vote. People need to get registered to vote, understand the importance of politics, understand the importance of good people serving us, and not get complacent so that you lose your rights, because there's so much up for grabs, like the Supreme Court case that will be decided before June 30th this year, which will determine the fate of affirmative action. They've already reversed Roe v. Wade. This conservative Supreme Court can do a lot. It did a lot with Presley versus Ferguson back in 1896 when they legalized segregation in this country after the tremendous gains of African Americans after the Civil War. People tend to forget that between 1865 and 1901, we elected 4 African Americans to Congress. It took us so long to do that again. It was like 1990 when Eva Clayton and Mel Watt got elected. People thought they were the first ones. The hands of time can turn backwards. And if we allow bad people to serve us in office and we don't go in there and work to get good people appointed to the courts, we're at risk. That's what Dr. King, in my opinion, would be concerned about. I probably took too long to answer that question.
No, that's no problem.
And for full disclosure, we have, and for those of you to say, I want to tell you that Floyd McKissick was a very effective senator who was able to work across the aisle to get things done for North Carolina. He is a Democrat, but we do have a few Republicans a little bit more conservative, but these are smart men, Dan Worthington and Shaquille Latimer, so they might not agree with everything you said. But I think the key is, how do we come together to figure out how we have common ground? And that's one
of the things I was going to ask, and I definitely want to hear from Shaquille and our other folks as well. But one of the things that I admired, particularly about your dad and also about Dr. King, and I'd love to hear your thoughts around this, Floyd, is that if people were of a different opinion or of a different thought pattern or everything, they were oftentimes conversations that were held in that space. Because one of the things that when I think of your dad, and sometimes when I even think of Dr. King, there are two things that I think about. And definitely there was a little bit of, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, but some Black nationalism that existed within your dad and all of that when he created the whole notion of Soul City and all of that. But he was also very much involved with Nixon and some of the enterprise zones and some of the capitalism things that also go on in the community as well. And I think that Dr. King was one that was willing to listen to people that were of different ideologies, even within the African-American community. But I just wanted your take on that, and if that is a correct perception from me of your dad and even some of the other people that were associated with Dr. King, that there were some that were more in the Black nationalism space.
Yeah, I mean, my father's very much involved in Black nationalism. When we traveled over to Africa, spent time, he went to a UN conference opposing apartheid in South Africa back in 1966. Meeting with Kenneth Kahuna, president of Zambia, and people over in Tanzania. He believed in establishing those ties. He was also one who believed in bipartisanship, meaning that if you had good people, notwithstanding what party affiliation they were, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, if you could come together and embrace the same principles and fight for the civil rights movement, and that was important. And I think it's very important to remember that, those that were fighting the Civil Rights Act of 1964 most desperately, that were opposed, were conservative Democrats in the Deep South. I mean, you found moderate Republicans, in the Northeast and across the country who were embracing the Civil Rights Act at that particular point in time. I can say during my years in the state Senate, there might be senators who were from conservative parts of our state where we might differ on issues related to women's reproductive rights, but we came together to pass legislation to give people a second chance who might have had criminal records and convictions. We came together, and when I said, look, we needed to reinstate Saturday voting, the last Saturday during the early vote period, we worked together on legislation which I was a co-sponsor of that got that done. And we said, look, the first hour of early voting is not working. Let's extend it to 7:30 in the evening and put that in the bill. And that was part of my provisions. We got it passed as bipartisan legislation. And we did that, back in, it must have been 2020 or so. And it was a good thing we did a lot of that. We changed the way the provisions were for people to go out there and vote absentee before the pandemic. If we had not done that, we would have been in a big trouble when the pandemic came, to allow better access for people to cast their votes remotely. So, that's a good example of bipartisanship. It's a good example of how you can have philosophical differences on issues related to immigration and come together on issues that are important. But so much of that is wanting to have those relationships and showing people mutual respect, understanding that you may have philosophical differences on some issues and be diametrically opposed, but come together as friends, as colleagues on those things that we can join forces on because it's in the best interest of all North Carolinians.
Fantastic. We have a few more minutes with Floyd. Any insights from Lee, Dan, or Shaquille? And we have Sasha Starr, who is from Ukraine, and he often provides insight on Ukraine and Russia war. We have a few more minutes, but just want to make sure anyone else can make some points with Floyd.
I have a question, if you don't mind. First
Please.
of all, thank you for coming, Floyd. It's a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for sharing all your thoughts. Obviously, we can't ask Dr. Martin Luther King what he thinks now, but in your words, what do you think he would have thought of the BLM movement?
I think he would applaud the fact that there is a Black Lives Movement, and applaud how everybody came together after the death of George Floyd. I think that the challenge with the Black Lives Movement is that it is not perhaps as highly organized as it could be, particularly, within cities or within states. I think that he would probably think of an organization more typically organized the way SCLC would have been, with local chapters and local presidents and local engagements and things they were taking on locally, as well as on a statewide basis and nationally. And knowing that national leadership was elected leadership that was reflective of a broad consensus of opinion and have very defined goals and objectives that they were seeking to carry out. I think he would applaud it. I think he would feel good about it, but I think he would perhaps feel as if its organizational structure could be more effective, and that some of their goals could be better articulated, and that it could be carried out on a multitude of levels as opposed to the way it is perhaps being carried out today.
Do you think he would have been saddened by those who abused the movement for violent purposes?
Yeah. What do you think? He didn't believe in violence, though.
No, not at all. That was not him.
Yes.
He would not
he was a
would
Prince
not
and
have
champion of
supported
nonviolence. Very much.
all the looting
No, he
and
would
the
not support
destruction, that was
violence.
all wrong.
So
Yeah.
can I
No,
say thank you, Floyd?
Shaquille, sorry, Shaquille.
He was a champion of nonviolence and embraced the principles of Mahatma Gandhi, the same way those within CORE did. Jim Farmer preceded my father. They believe in nonviolence. I mean, now, did we believe freedom rides? Yes, but that was not violence. That was not looting. That was walking into the face of those who were opponents to equal rights and standing up for equal rights for all. So I think in terms of violence, it would not be something he would at all embrace. In fact, he would support.
Yeah, that was bad.
So thank you for being on the show, Floyd. I am Australian. I'll correct Steve. I don't live in Australia, but I am Australian. I'm also British. I say that to the tax department. Doesn't give me a hard time. So I travel the world quite a lot, and I observe different issues around the world. Black Lives Matter, after George Floyd was killed by the police, became a movement all over the world. And there were instances around the world where I looked at them and I was kind of surprised. I was sort of, what are you arguing about? This didn't happen here. This happened in America. So there were some things that I found a little confusing. And I can tell you that unrelated to George Floyd, prior to George Floyd, I was in London when there was a 700,000 person protest going on about Brexit. And it was going past my hotel, and I thought, I don't want to stay all the way up here in my hotel and look at this. I want to go down because I really want to see what 700,000 people look like. And so I came down, and then it was quite interesting because there was a BLM flag. This is before George Floyd in the Brexit Remain camp protest, and I was looking at that. I was like, what does that have to do with Brexit? I'm a bit confused by that. And so I was talking to somebody about it, and one of them came up to me and told me that I was a skinhead Nazi. And I was like, Okay, right. And when I got to the United States, I had friends up in Chicago, and again, this is before George Floyd, so I didn't actually really know what Black Lives Matter was as an organization. I didn't know what they were about. Why would I? I'm not from America, so I just asked one of my friends when I was in Chicago. I said, "This Black Lives Matter thing, like what is it? What are they trying to achieve? What is it that they're representing?" And somebody, again, had nothing to do with me, just came over and just berated me, just yelled at me for like 5 minutes. And, told me I was a traitor to people of color and all these things. And I was like, I just asked what it is. Is it an organization? Is it a company? Is it what is this group? I think that what people often forget, and you talked about some of the divisiveness in politics today, is that reasonable people can agree on some things and disagree on others. Absolutely. Black Lives Matter as an organization is a group whose founders say that they are Marxists. Now, I don't have a problem with that. If you believe that Marxism is a better way of arranging the economy, that's fine. It's a free country. You can believe that. I don't feel that way. I personally think that capitalism is a better way of going. And I get a little confused as to why left-wing political parties and left-wing political ideologies seem to think that they have the exclusive right to speak for people of color or to speak for women or to speak for other minorities. I just find that a little bewildering. And, I noticed well that you mentioned about affirmative action. I think there are a lot of people, including myself, who can often feel that affirmative action is sometimes being used to exclude people based on the color of their skin over things that happened well before they were alive and probably didn't involve their families. A lot of white people that live in America today weren't around. Their families weren't in America during the slavery years. So I think that there needs to be a balance. And I fear that some of the groups that say that they talk for and represent minority communities are often doing so in such a divisive way that makes people feel attacked that they actually lose some support. And Martin Luther King, the great man that he was, he lost a little bit of support when he opposed the Vietnam War. I think that he was absolutely right to oppose the Vietnam War, but he had to be very careful about how he went about doing that. So, I just think that you shouldn't be required to subscribe to all the views of somebody else in order to be supportive of the overall movement.
Market data connection reestablished.
Yeah, and I would simply say that I think that what we have to have in politics and in dialogue and generally is mutual respect of each other's differences, understanding that there will be areas where we can find common ground and other areas we may respectfully disagree. I'm not familiar with the way Black Lives Matter was perceived outside of the United States. I think what it did raise here was a level of social consciousness as particularly related to police conduct when it came to interactions with African Americans, where they were on the street, where they were in their automobiles. I think it illuminated the fact that there was still much to be done in terms of opening up access to opportunities for people regardless of color. I think it brought together a level of social consciousness that we still had a ways to go, notwithstanding how far we've come in the last 50 or 60 years. I think in terms of most people participating in those rallies after the death of George Floyd and rallies that have taken place since then and have continued, they were concerned about bringing down Confederate statues here in the United States that were symbolic of an era that represented slavery in the eyes of African Americans. They were people who were encouraging what has now been called wokeness, which is being aware of American history with all of its attributes and with all of its flaws and with all of the things that were morally reprehensible in terms of enslavement of other individuals, telling the complete story, not an altered view of that reality, and letting people reach their own conclusion. Those are the things I think of I don't think of the individual views of the leaders of the Black Lives Movement that might have been more in tune with Marxism or things of that nature. I mean, I was very disappointed to read stories about some of those leaders using money coming to the organization to buy extravagant homes that were, $3, $4, $5 million, things like that. That I found very disappointing, and I hope that was simply an aberration and might have been one person or another that was money that they had from other sources. But the way it was reported was gave you concern about perhaps some of that leadership. And that's why I go back to the focus that I indicated in terms of what Dr. King would want. He would want it to be better organized. He would want it to be more strategic. He would want to see it involved more on a local and state level. He'd rather see more clearly defined, articulable goals and a leadership team that was democratically elected by those that are members of the organization, supporters of the organization, that would be a multiracial coalition determined to carry things forward in a way that he would have challenged us 50 years ago.
So, Senator, you mentioned about teaching, history, or warts and all with American history, and look, I think that's important. But I have an enormous amount of respect for the United States, and from either Australia or the UK, what we see is American kids setting fire to the American flag. We see American athletes bowing for the national anthem. We see American athletes on the international stage turning their back to the American flag and being hostile towards the anthem. Now, to me, that would not represent, them acting that way does not represent the United States. The United States has had a history where there's been slavery. It has had a history where people have not always been treated correctly. That's absolutely true. But I would say that more than just about any other country on earth, with maybe the exceptions of the other New World countries like New Zealand and Australia and Canada, that the United States has worked tremendously hard. During the Civil War, people who were white were prepared to sacrifice their lives in that Civil War in order to try to do something about slavery. And I think that history gets forgotten when people act as though America was founded with racist ideas, and so therefore America is inherently racist through and through. I don't feel that way about the United States. I think that that's, again, where a lot of this division actually comes from. One of the things that I see at the moment between Democrats and Republicans at the federal level, you have Republicans saying that Democrats, they're all woke, they want to trans your kids, they want to destroy the school system, they want to tax you to hell, and they're just going to destroy the place of regulations. You have Democrats that accuse the Republicans of undermining the democracy. The republic is in peril. The republic's going to fail. America will no longer exist if the Democrats get control. And there's no middle ground between those two positions. And unfortunately, if you watch CNN or Fox, hey Kim, if you watch these two sort of networks or the two, the left wing and right wing media, those are the two extreme ideas that you hear. And I actually think that's harmful. I think that having respectful, calm conversations like we are and actually working through these issues would be a much better thing for our politicians to do. Kim, welcome to the show.
Yeah. Well, we want to introduce you to Kimberly Calhoun, who's the founder and president of IBM TV, now Pod and Roku TV. She also worked with NC State. She lives in Raleigh, so we're here because of her. So this is Senator McKissick, former state senator Kimberly, whose father was a good friend of Dr. King's.
Oh, I know Senator McKissick. He actually helped me with something. He's a good man. He understands the needs of our communities. And, I just appreciate everything you have done for us, Senator McKissick. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your very kind remarks. And the only remark I would have to the preceding comments that were made was that I don't think of America as a monolithic block. I think that there are good people on both sides of the political aisle. I think there are good people within all of these organizations. And I think we should respect each other. I think so much of what was accomplished during the days of the civil rights movement. While you might have had African American protesters out there that were young, that were teenagers or college students, at the same time, so much of the money that came in and support the organizations like Ford, like NAACP, like SNCC and SCLC, came in from whites. It came in from the Jewish community. I mean, I would see my father on many, many weekends go out to receptions.
Yeah.
I want to add to Shaq. Shaq was dead on about observing what other countries see of us. Sometimes what you see isn't the whole story. You're just getting the book cover. You're not getting the story. And that's one of the reasons why Nick and I had started our first TV show together, is so that you can see that there's more to the book than just the cover, which is what most people only get. Also, we started this network because we became extremely exhausted and tired with the lies, the fake news, and being told if it doesn't bleed, it doesn't lead. And that is not the true story. We wanted to become more educational and entertaining, because a lot of people, they don't want just education. And Nick and I wanted to close that gap between poverty and sustainability. And I hope I didn't run off Senator McKissick.
I think
Boy was having some Wi-Fi issues and everything.
Okay.
That's a great. I have to leave in 5 minutes to head to another.
Let's see what happened, Kim. The rest of us, he was fine with. You showed up and he left. See what you've done to our guests.
Well, I was going to close out with this. But you made me think of a line in my favorite movie. One of my favorite movies. I was actually Floyd.
Welcome back.
Thank you. I'm not sure where I dropped off, but I was only talking about being inclusive and respecting the contributions of those that were white, that were Jewish, who helped fund the civil rights movement, who put their lives on the line each and every day in fighting for civil rights, where they didn't have to because it was important. So on that note, I'm sure there's so much more that needs to be said by others that are here today. So I'm going to sit back and listen.
Well, before we go into the next round.
If you ever decide to run for politics in Australia, I'll certainly vote for you. So we might need you to share some of your experience down here.
There you go. Maybe you can become ambassador of Australia.
Shaq, you can't have him. I love him. So go ahead, Steve. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, we're going to get into some other issues around the world, but real quickly, and we'd love to have Senator McKissick give us some insight, particularly energy and because he's on the Utilities Commission. Maybe a good opportunity to maybe talk a little bit about that. But I'll just throw out my favorite line of one of my favorite movies, American President, played by Michael Douglas, who he's doing his final speech, and he says, "American citizenship is advanced citizenship. You've got to want it real bad." He goes, "How do you show a flag of a man who gave his life for the country, that flag still stands, while at the same time respect the man of a citizen who wants to burn it in protest?" He says, that's America. That's what, and so that to me, Shaquille, is kind of hard to understand. I think that there's this freedom that you have that makes America great, and kind of how we've been able to keep a free society, but at the same time have a strong government that prevents chaos. I think that's been the American secret sauce. I actually believe that, and I don't believe that, I think democracy's had its challenges, but I truly believe that the United States of America will stand the test of time. Even if the insurrection on the Capitol wasn't successful, you can't attack the Capitol. Though, I mean, it wasn't successful in that the government kept moving on. Right?
It wasn't supposed to be.
Can I put a proposition to you, though? Let me just put a proposition to you. Let's just imagine that the people that took over the Capitol didn't do what they did. But let me just put a proposition to you. What if Mike Pence had have said, you know what, you're right. I have some concerns about the way that the election was conducted. And so I'm not going to certify the election. Let's just put that as a proposition. Do you think that the United States would cease to exist because of that? What would happen? See, I have faith in US institutions. I have faith in your system of government. I have, look, you don't always get it right. There are some things I think you could do better. The voting, for example, I'm very vocal about things I think America could look at changing. But the idea that because Mike Pence, which he didn't do, but if Mike Pence had have said, I'm not going to certify this election, I want a review, of how the elections were conducted in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania and the other states, Wisconsin and Michigan. If he had have done that, the United States is still there. Okay, the Congress would work it out. The court system would work it out. And all that would have happened is that there would have been a challenge to the way things are done. Now, the reality is that, just recently, for example, the last few months, Donald Trump seemed to be trying to imply that there was new evidence, that proves that the election was stolen from him. Now, this is rubbish. It's not going to work. But let's just say that let's say he could. Let's say he was able to prove this. This would not mean that Biden would have to step down. Once the election is certified, it's certified. So you actually have that built into your system. It's not a straight out. I know Lee has corrected me on this a couple of times, but right. I'm talking about the federal level, not Mark Lee, sorry, Lee Newton Rhodes. But in relation to the what's happening at the federal level, things like ending the filibuster. Before you talk about ending it because of how it's affecting you today, you have to go back and look at why the filibuster was introduced. You have to actually have some sort of debate and say, well, if we don't have the filibuster, how will we make sure that minority voices are heard within the Congress? How do we make sure that we're not going to have the tyranny of the majority? And there's a reason why you're a constitutional republic. You're run by democratic values, but individual rights you have to protect yourself from government with constitutional rights. This is an important part of your thing. So, again, looking from it from an outsider's perspective, for somebody who doesn't live in the United States, a lot of things that we hear reported in American media sound like you're trying to change the very system that has given you the freedoms that you have. And that, I think, is really concerning, because when you guys do stuff, it affects all the rest of us.
Hey, Floyd, along those same lines, I'd love to hear your thoughts, if at all possible, and everything. And it actually comes back to what Shaquille, to some degree, was talking about, because yes, there was the January 6th incident 2 years ago, but as I recall, there was also another incident that was held actually around the time of your dad being living, and also Dr. King being around. And that was kind of the riots that took part by some of the Democratic parties in Chicago. And there was definitely what some people might consider a show trial during that time as well. And I was just wondering if you see some of the parallels between those two incidences, even though they are about 40 years apart, maybe even 50 years apart, and all in that space. Because I do remember that we haven't had one of the January 6 people in shackles that I'm aware of, but there were definitely some of those that were in the Chicago that were, but there are some other parallels that I could see. But I'm just wondering your take on that.
You don't think the January 6 people have been in shackles? They're all sitting in solitary confinement. What are you talking about?
Well, I mean, there's certainly parallels in terms of unrest that was present at that particular point in time. None of the unrest and concern reached the point of there being some type of mass crowd coming to the steps of the Capitol and being motivated by the president to enter the chamber and potentially change the way the election outcome would have been based upon democratically held elections in the 50 states. So nothing really paralleled that. Were there unrest in Chicago in 1968? Absolutely. Did we end up with a peculiar election result that year? Yeah, we ended up with Nixon being elected with, as I recall, it was certainly less than a majority of the vote, but the vote was split between Hubert Humphrey, George Wallace, as I received, Wallace got about 13% of the vote, and Nixon, who won the election that year. And of course, back in 64, even before then, when the Mississippi Free Democratic Party wanted to be seated at the National Democratic Convention. So, I mean, there have been protests, there have been concerns. They've occurred within the parties. So, I mean, I think that the key thing is that we always keep our eyes on the prize. And the eyes on the prize, in my mind, means, we have a constitution. Now, when it was written, it did not envision men, women, all being treated equally. But the way it has been historically interpreted, it does today. It does not envision slaves and their ancestors as being 3/5 of a man. We're now recognized as being equal. It now embraces the idea of women's suffrage, with women having the same rights to vote as anyone else who does. It speaks about, equal justice for all. It speaks about everyone's pursuit of happiness. It respects the right of privacy, which was what Roe v. Wade was based upon in terms of women's reproductive right to choose. So while we have a document that was written by men back in the 1700s, the way it's been actualized, the way it has been interpreted as enforced, has transformed it to our day and to this current point in time. And we should think of it as aspirational in terms of what we want, what we seek, and what we value, and understand that we may have come across on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now and working together that with that rainbow coalition, particularly in today being King Day, thinking about what it means for people to be able to achieve their rights, able to achieve their dreams, ready to be respected, regardless of what border they cross to get here. It's something that's important. It's something that's significant, and something that can be achieved and can be accomplished. And it will continue to evolve in terms of its meaningfulness and in terms of the way that we, as citizens, through our election of leaders and the appointment and election of judges, allows it to become actualized.
And I'm gonna close out because I want to leave. I have to leave a little bit early today. Close a little early, but go ahead and respond to that. Then I'm gonna thank Floyd for coming, and I'm gonna close out before I leave. But go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a quick question for Floyd, really quickly, and it's about leadership, and it's a very quick one and everything. But some people would say that Reverend Barber has some of the similar kind of flavor of a Dr. King. There are definitely some political leaders like Eric Abrams up in New York and Hakeem Jeffries, who I know that we both had the pleasure of meeting last year, and I know you've probably met him several times that might be in that same lineage. But I was wondering, do you see anybody in the African-American community that is of that stature of Dr. King in our current political landscape?
Probably Dr. Barber is the largest, is the most important visual leader today that I think embodies much of what the civil rights movement embodied, and has showed political courage to champion goals. Through the North Carolina General Assembly, was changed over, and Republicans were there for the first time in charge in over 100 years. Started a Moral Monday movement that taught across America. And it's led so many other efforts. Poor People's Campaign, which is something that Dr. King actually articulated, and which Jesse Jackson tried to carry out after his death. And of course, we have Dr. Barber now going on to Yale and being affiliated with Yale University in new capacity. I think he would probably best embody, in my mind, a leader who is contemporary today, who's active and engaged, who is carrying on that torch, that proverbial torch, for the next generation. Somebody who, regardless of when I reach out to him, takes that call or he calls back. And I know his intrinsic moral barometer and where he stands. So among those today, he would be one that epitomizes, I think, the civil rights movement. I think of Hakeem Jeffries, he epitomizes what I would call Black political power that my father so often talked about in getting people elected to office back when we only had, 12 or 14 members of Congress. And to see him today as a minority leader and somebody who might, in the next 2 years or so, become Speaker of the House and third in line to the presidency is important and symbolic, and somebody who is building a base of coalitions and support, not only in Congress but across America. So,
Floyd, what do you think of Tim Scott?
What's that?
Tim Scott. What's your opinion of Tim Scott?
Tim Scott is somebody who, I think as a Republican senator from South Carolina, he stands up and he speaks on issues dealing with the judiciary and sometimes appointments of judges, and certainly in terms of judges that we're going to appoint it to the district court here in federal district court here in North Carolina. I think he's somebody who champions a position. I respect him enormously. He's probably not somebody I'm going to agree with the vast majority of the time, but to the extent to which he stands up and speaks up and shows political courage on occasions when it's needed, then I commend him for that. And I hope he speaks up within his caucus, in that Senate caucus, to provide a voice of consciousness and reasonableness on issues where otherwise it may not be heard, and it may not be spoken, and it may not be articulated at times that we are likely unaware of. He serves a role. You need good people on both political parties as well as people who are independent, because it's all coming together that can make a difference in this country. And we need to respect each other even when we disagree.
Well, I'm going to thank Floyd McKissick for coming. I'm going to close out. I've got an event I have to attend today as a guest at the MLK in Carborough, but I wanted to thank Senator McKissick for coming. My closeout, my final take is I just want to thank everyone for celebrating King Day with us on Pod and Roku TV. I think, as we've said, it's about how we live our lives, and we may not agree on everything, but I think we can take our own empathy, our own compassion, and try to get uncomfortable sometimes and stand up for those causes that we believe in. My great-grandfather was the Speaker of the House in British India of one of the largest states, Tamil Nadu, and all the family knows is that he left Gandhi's movement. He left to join Gandhi's movement. At the time, the Indian freedom movement wasn't popular, but many of the Raos became freedom fighters, including his son, who was the mayor of Madras. And throughout my whole lifetime, I found it interesting that Dr. King got his own ideas about civil disobedience from Gandhi. But what they both had in common, I call them the moral Jedi, like the Star Wars series, the peacekeepers, those that were able to show the world that you can change the world. And not through Facebook, not through social media, not through the operating systems and devices, but literally going down and talking to people, telling them, this is why I want this to be. Even Dr. King himself would disagree with Lyndon Johnson, the President of the United States, but they sat in the Oval Office together, looked each other in the eye, and finally worked through some serious issues and changed America for the better. Hopefully we can get back to doing some of that here in the United States of America, and hopefully we'll talk about that in the future. But I want to thank Floyd for being with us. I'll be back tomorrow for another edition of Roku and Pod TV. Thank you all for being with us today. And I'll let you close out, Mark. You got 3 more minutes.
Yeah. Floyd, I think, had some thoughts. Did you have some final thoughts you wanted to share, Floyd?
Not at all. It's my privilege and honor to join you today, particularly in this significant occasion. And I thank you, Steve. Thank you, Mark. And thank all of you that are part of this call today. I think it's an excellent forum. I hope that people have listened in, and perhaps we have shared some thoughts that might cause them to think a second time about where we go and what still is yet needs to be done.
Yeah, and Sasha, we didn't hear from you at all. I'm sorry, we ran out of time. So if you can give Sasha the last word, please. Yep. And as I will say, I'll end with my favorite quote before I leave. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can. And hate cannot drive out hate, only love can. So from our family here at Roku TV, let the light and love of our hearts always lift us out of the darkness. That's our true operating system. Thank you. This is Steve House signing off. And Sasha Starr, the last word, 2 minutes, please. Yes. I'm off. See you tomorrow.
Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes is not enough to cover what's happening in Ukraine. And
you start tomorrow.
I have to review that tomorrow, of course. I just have one question which bothers me still. The Black Lives Matters movement. Was it there before what's happened to Floyd, or yes. It was before, right?
It was already there.
We heard very little about it. And also, there are significant black populations in European countries like England, like France, Germany, some others. Is there also such a movement? And if
well,
yes...
This was my comment, if you remember on previous shows, because I've said to Mark, it's really unfair in my opinion, of African Americans in the United States to criticize the United States, but not criticize European countries who, when they ended slavery, either sent the slaves back to Africa or sold them to America. They're not doing anything, but yet America is the one that's constantly blamed, and America is the one that said, no, we will emancipate our slaves, we give them voting rights, we give them equal rights, etc. They didn't send them off anywhere else. And these European countries just get away with it. And like you have rightly pointed out, what happened in Haiti, right? The countries responsible for that should be doing something about it. So you know,
Shaquille, along those same lines.
And one more quick question is that since all the trade, at least in the first couple of hundred years, was done by Portuguese slave traders, most of them didn't even come to US. It's much later. They all came mostly to Brasilia and some Central American countries, but Brasilia, the biggest by far. And I'm wondering, is there a movement, Black Lives Matter, in Brazil, for example? What do you know about that?
Well, I don't know about Brazil, but what I can say to you is that in European countries and other parts of the world where I've been, they've tacked onto the back of Black Lives Matter. But what they've ended up doing is they've ended up attacking the United States as if it's only the United States that has been responsible for this in our history. And I think
Shaquille, I know
European countries to do that.
Shaquille, I know we've got to wind down, and maybe Floyd might have some last thoughts I'm going to bring up because I was going to bring it up earlier. But there is Black Lives Matter movements that exist that ironically are similar to what we talk about in the United States. But we do know that there's black on black crime, and there's actually a country in Africa that has had its own version of Black Lives Matter, which is Nigeria. And there's been a whole conversation between the Nigerian police and some of the Nigerian citizens. So they've had their own version of Black Lives Matter, but it may not get as much conversation because it is both of the folks that are involved are of the same nationality as opposed to what happens in some of the other countries.
Floyd McKissick talked earlier, and I'll be very brief because we're over time, about apartheid in South Africa. What a terrible regime that was. And I think I can understand how people would feel, when you come into their country and they can't get jobs and all of that. But there are reports at the moment that now we have mass amounts of white people that are living in poverty and they can't get jobs and they're being excluded. Now, you have to feel for them as well because they may not have had anything to do with what happened 100 years ago, and they can't go anywhere. They can't go back to their own countries where they're originally from because those countries are saying you're not a citizen, and they can't stay in these countries. These countries don't want them, and they're stuck. And frankly, that's what's happened to my family, who've been forced over to Fiji by the British, and then the British said, well, you're not British, and the Fijians say, we don't want you. And our family has been left, my family has been devastated for generations before we were able to get out of Fiji. There has to be a balance, and you have to look at things from everybody's perspective, not just your own.
Very quick question to you. Since in Africa, white people represent a tiny minority, why we never heard about White Lives Matter in Africa, for example?
Well, I think white people have been, unfortunately, the oppressors for much of modern African history. But as I said, at the moment, things are now changing. And I think that Africa has to decide what you want to do with that minority population. And if you don't want them there, if you think Africa is for Africans, then you have to do something to transition them back into European citizenships if they'll go. But I just think you can't have this situation where people are trapped, where a country says you don't belong here, and the countries that they originally come from 100 years ago say, well, you're not part of our countries anymore. Where do these people go? It's the more that we talk and focus on race, and we only talk about one race or one skin color or one ethnicity, the more that everybody else is getting stuck and getting like they've got nowhere to go. And this is going to boil over at some point. We have to be very careful. We have to think about things from other perspectives. We have to be diplomatic and try to resolve things peacefully so that we don't see a race war just erupt around the world between different people who otherwise would have gotten along.
Hey, I know we got ready to end because we do have the economic show going to come up and all of that. But just really quickly, I did want to hear from Floyd about the importance of Dr. King, his dad, and others being role models. So if you can maybe answer that in a minute or two, I'd love to hear your thoughts around the importance of these historical figures being role models.
Well, I think, my dad, Dr. King, Stokely Carmichael, late Congressman John Mitchell, they all epitomize leaders who fought for a better America, that fought for equal rights and opportunities for all, that were not afraid to put their lives on the line to get there, that weren't afraid to make great sacrifices to do so. They did so at a time where it was not always popular. They did so at a time where courage and conviction is what led them. And I think today, if we think about where we need to go, we still need more courageous leaders. We need more people who are principled. We need more people who will don't necessarily have a personal agenda, but have a political agenda that advances those that have not yet served in that American economic mainstream, that still don't have access to those opportunities, that for whatever reason are repressed because of their race, because of their religion, because of their gender identity or sexual orientation. Those that want to still have access to what so many people today have obtained, particularly when we have a growing African-American middle class in our country. There's still so many that are left behind, that are in poverty. We need to continue to fight those battles. We still need to champion those battles. We still need to never lose sight of being a better America and achieving that dream.
I appreciate that. And on that note, we're going to end this show, and we'll have some more conversations on tomorrow on the World Edition, and definitely looking forward to that show. And also, we know that Sasha Starr will be having the show around Ukraine on tomorrow as well. So we're looking forward to hearing how that war is going and how that has freedom fight is also taking place as well. So we're looking forward to finding out how that is going in this particular direction, and hopefully there'll be, as Sasha says at the end of just about all of his shows, good news coming in that department and in the way of that country being free at some point or another. But right now we're going to end, and we'll see y'all on tomorrow at 10 o'clock.